has often struck me how little people seem to know or think of the social misery within it may be a few hundred yards of the great thoroughfares of our city, or know of the dwellings of the poor, with the tendency to crowd them into the smallest space is so great that it would seem to be an understood law of nature that the poor do not actually require as much fresh air as the wealthy. Disease is undeniably associated with defective housing, a deficient diet, and an unhealthy environment, especially so for the old, the unemployed, women in the home and their growing children, who spend a greater part of their time in houses that are not properly constructed or repaired, and the social facilities are minimal. There is no one capable of reflection who should not recognize the force of these statements, the fundamental laws of health, and the certainty that we must pay the penalty for their neglect and violation.
These are the 8 o'clock headlines. A UDR soldier was killed in a booby trap explosion last night. Ulster farmers are seeking further subsidies from Europe. Record rainfall has been reported in many parts of the province. An EEC report has pinpointed Northern Ireland as one of the most disadvantaged regions in Europe.
Women in Northern Ireland are more likely to die from disease before the age of 60 than in nearly every other country in Western Europe. We die prematurely from respiratory diseases, pneumonia and bronchitis, nowadays a condition often attributed to smoking, although we smoke less than many Europeans. We have topped the world tables for heart disease in women for the past 8 years. Each year, babies are born with congenital handicaps like spina bifida, which has had an incidence rate on a par with those found in the Third World. In Northern Ireland, conditions common to Western industrial society like heart disease and cancer exist side by side with higher incidences of diseases more common to poorer developing countries. An EEC report described us as the second most deprived region in Western Europe, comparable to parts of southern Italy. In Belfast, the worst patterns of health are still to be found in the poorest areas. We die from diseases that are known to be preventable, known to be associated with living conditions, unemployment, discrimination, stress, hardship, and the growing complexity of our lives as women throughout this century. For over 100 years, Belfast was the centre of the linen industry. Today, most of the mills and factories stand empty, derelict, or have been demolished. Although they no longer dominate the skyline or the lives of the thousands of women for whom it was not just a job, but a way of life, they have left an important legacy.
Well, I was around about 15 when I went to start working Ginny Mountain Mill, and I went in as a doffer, and that was doffing the frames. Conditions were bad. You were running about in water all the time, in your bare feet. And even the frames, the water was dripping down onto the bobbins from the frames. It was a wet spinning. And your hand and all were in water all day, and you wore a big oilskin overall, like a big apron, and the water would have been running out of it.
At practically every stage in the manufacture of linen, women were exposed to serious health risks, of which the most widespread were chest infections, bronchitis and pneumonia. Flax thread is brittle, and to prevent it from breaking, temperatures had to be kept in the 70s and 80s. The atmosphere was damp and hot, and the air loaded with flax dust, commonly known as pouse.
affected your chest and affected your lungs. And a lot of people had bronchitis, and then some people had congestion, and some took pleurisy. In fact, my lungs were infected, and I brought blood up many a time, and still do to this day.
Spitting blood?
Spitting blood, yes.
Was that common in those times?
It was very much so common, yes. I left the mill and got started in the weaving factory. And it was a terrible lot of push. You had to brush it out twice a day, brush it all up twice a day. And you were breathing that in all the time. You had that stuck in your throat and in your chest, and up your nose and all. And you used to come out at night, 6 o'clock, and your hair would have been like snow.
Our mothers worked hard in the mills. They worked from dawn till dusk. They walked barefoot through water, lungs filled with pus and dust. The flex work aged our workers, and many it did kill. They had to rise at 5 o'clock, and at 6 be in the mill. The workers weren't allowed to laugh, to sing or leave their frames, and because no guards were on machines, some were either killed or maimed. Their throats dried up, some spat out blood. They coughed beyond belief. The doffers' rubber aprons a good job did not do, for the wet spray from the spinning frames still soaked the workers through. Their feet and legs were swollen, mill fever all did know, chest problems, fallen arches and afflictions to the toe. The owners made large profits, lived in luxury and wealth, while the workers got a pittance, poverty, ill health.
What kind of houses did the mill workers live in?
Well, they lived in ordinary kitchen houses, and that was a kitchen and a wee room off the kitchen and your scullery and 2 bedrooms, and you had a yard, and your toilet was in the yard.
Outside?
Outside in the yard. There was no bathrooms, and you just had to wash yourself at a big sink. Just an ordinary kitchen sink.
Was there any warm water in those?
There was no warm water, no. You had to put a bucket on and heat your water. If you wanted to bath the children, now you had a big sink bath, and you bathed the children and that. Put a bucket on the stove for to heat the water.
Tell us about the kind of problems that you had to live with in the houses. Was there any?
Well, we lived in a house and there was bugs in it.
What kind of bugs?
Bed bugs. And at night, they came out at night when you were sleeping, and the arms and the legs would have been eaten off you with bugs, and you'd have been getting up and you'd have been killing the bugs on the walls, and would have maybe some in your bed. I had to destroy a whole bed one time, set fire to it in an entry, where the bugs had got in the seams of the bed, pounds, and I bought a bed without pounds. Well, then my husband brought red lead out of the shipyard, and he painted the walls with the red lead, and that done away with them. And we also had cockroaches. If you had to come down the stairs at night for to use the toilet, your kitchen floor would have been full of cockroaches. You wouldn't have knew where they tramped on for to miss them, and you were on about killing them. And you had mice too. But you were always cleaning and scrubbing to keep it clean, and buckets of disinfectant. You were scrubbing your place out with disinfectant and doing your rooms out with disinfectant, all for to try to keep it down.
For years, the responsibility for providing decent housing lay firmly in the hands of the Unionists, who dominated both the Northern Irish government and the Belfast Corporation, a class of landowners, landlords and businessmen whose powerful self-interests left public house building at the mercy of private enterprise and political intrigue. The effects of poor housing should be obvious. Cold and damp play a large part in chronic respiratory infections and infant mortality. Such facts rarely surfaced in political debates. When they did, they were often dismissed.
You are responsible for at least 100,000 people being in their graves for the last 20 years. The Minister of Public Security and the Minister of Home Affairs is laughing. You wouldn't house your dogs. in the places in which these people have to live.
The poor do not attempt to better themselves or their conditions. I am of the belief that our national vigour is impaired by the saving of the lives of the unfit.
These housing conditions couldn't be equalled in any part of the British Commonwealth and nations. Conditions existing in Derry and elsewhere are worse than in the Middle Ages. Government's done absolutely nothing. 100,000 houses are needed in Ulster, and they will cost £100 million. No wonder the honourable member for North Armagh laughs. No matter what health scheme may be brought in, unless we have good housing and hygienic conditions, it'll be a failure. Because health and housing must go hand in hand.
Well, I was 40 years waiting on a house to be allocated to me. And they said, give me one away at the bottom of the mountains at Ballymurphy. And my husband by this time had went to England to work. And there was no way I was going to take 4 children up to the foot of the mountains on my own with them. I was too scared to be on my own with them, 4 of them. And I thought, well, it was better where I was, because I knew everybody and I wasn't going to go up in among strangers.
What's your own health like?
Well, my own health is not good. I've had a heart attack and I've chronic bronchitis, and my lungs aren't so good either.
Do you think the bad housing conditions?
Yes, the bad housing condition done that, because I was laying in a damp room all the time, the water running down the walls.
Life before the Second World War was harsh. Social services were of a lower standard than in Britain. Sanitation a disgrace, rivers choked with rubbish and sewage. Unlike Britain, medical treatment had to be paid for or begged under the Poor Laws. Infant mortality had at times been twice that of English cities, and in the first 20 years of Unionist rule, the numbers of women dying in childbirth had increased. Tuberculosis was rampant. Seen as an inevitable disease, it had been responsible for half the deaths of teenagers and young people. Although improvements were to come with the introduction of the National Health Service, a measure that Unionists voted against, it was, by its very nature, concerned to treat the symptoms of ill health. It could not prevent many conditions happening in the first place. Beyond the confines of its hospital wards, many of the causes were all too evident. Hardship, unemployment, ever-deteriorating housing conditions. Building plans for Belfast, drawn up in the 1940s, particularly for the inner city, had gathered dust. By the 1960s, 87% of houses needed repairs, and a third of the city was made up of housing that had been built before 1850. Many of them the small, damp, basic houses that earlier generations had crowded into to escape the famine and destitution of 19th century rural Ireland.
Before New Barnsley, I lived down Lower Falls, and I rented 2 up and 2 downer. And before we went into it, it was in pretty bad condition because it had been let lie for a while. And we had to put in new doors, new floors, new windows. We rewired part of the house, put a couple of stairs and things like that in, because you couldn't have moved into it in the condition that it was in. Well, we were all delighted at first to having a house of our own. And after a while, we started noticing cockroaches and other creepy crawlies coming into the house. And then whenever the troubles all started, and they dug the pavements up outside the doors for to put behind the barricades, they started coming in their hundreds. So when I started noticing them up the stairs, I started checking the kids' beds, and I was putting the DDT. Every morning when they got up, I put it down the mattress, around the springs of the beds, in between all the bedclothes. Then during the night, well, round about every half an hour, I just couldn't sleep with the thoughts off and maybe being in the kids' beds not there with them. So I started then, I was getting up every half an hour and lifting the kids from one bed into another bed, shaking those bedclothes, shaking the curtains, lifting them all back into the other bed and doing the same in that bed, shaking out those bedclothes. I went everywhere to try to get rehoused out of it. Just kept saying 2, 3, 4, 5 years you'll be getting a new house out of it. Well, I didn't want one 2, 3, 4, 5 years. I wanted one right away.
Attempts to catch up on the massive backlog of housing led to the building of cheap flats and maisonettes, particularly in the late 60s, when the inherent problems of such accommodation had become obvious throughout the world. Despite this evidence, the Stormont government not only went ahead, but built them with inferior materials and to standards that would not have been acceptable in Britain. Widespread political protest with the advent of the Troubles finally brought unionist control over housing to an end. Decision-making passed into the hands of Westminster, administered through the Northern Ireland Housing Executive. For over 100 years, the Belfast Corporation had been continually accused and found guilty of the gross neglect and corruption that has created some of the worst housing in Europe. We now confront the bitter legacy. Whole communities within Belfast's inner city have been relentlessly bulldozed into rubble. Both old houses and new estates are crumbling, and the 30-year rehousing programme is unlikely to be completed until the 1990s.
Schemes to get from A to B, annihilate communities, last gasp of self-dignity, no more space, just wait and seek. Careerists carry out their plans, never listen to our demands, building slums despite us, and thanks for gastroenteritis, more repression at the odd concession. Everybody hear the change, when you move, feel the strain, everybody feels the pain, one step back and lose the game, to bureaucrats and two-faced rats to heed along and pass the buck, pass the buck, poverty hits, pass the buck, poverty hits. I'm screaming at the schemers! 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 Destitute and weaker, install another meter. Can't afford the heater, that'll help defeat her. Suicide's the answer, 'cause words don't seem to matter. So have another dancer, not here but over there, sir. Yeah, have another dancer, not here but over there, sir. Not here but over there, not here but over there, sir. Not here but over there, not here but over there, sir. Not here but over there, not here but over there, sir.
Moyard, West Belfast, 1982. The first case of polio reported in 5 years in the UK. A scene reminiscent of the 1950s, as queues of women and children waited for emergency vaccination.
And we had been warning the authorities a year previous to it that polio could occur in the estate. And then there was a young boy, Jared, that died. That the post-mortem showed he had died of an acute form of pneumonia. It was a very rare form of it. This form of pneumonia that Jared died of was attributed to extreme dampness and extreme coldness, which the child was living in the maisonettes, the conditions the child was living in. And then we had the other cases of gastroenteritis. There's another 5 children were admitted to Beaver Park Hospital with gastroenteritis and dysentery. There was numbers, countless other children had been admitted that had the same disease, but hadn't been reported.
75% of all hepatitis cases in Belfast were coming from the Moyard area. Rats, mice, even farm animals roamed the estate. Some of the residents bitten by rats arrived at hospital with the rats still clinging to them. Moyard was seen as a dumping ground for one-parent families. With outside help, the women carried out tests on water lying throughout the estate and found that it consisted of 90% raw sewage.
Well, I lived in the third one at the bottom here, so I did. And they're not very, very well made maisonettes, as you can see. Eileen lived in them as well as me, so she did.
I lived in, the block I lived in was over there, but it was something like this one here, the top one. And in the winter, as you can see yourself, the wind that's going now, In the winter, we lived directly facing the mountain, and it was just like standing here. It just used to come right through the whole masonette.
You couldn't heat the masonettes up at all, so you couldn't. And then these boards under the windows, they're made of hardboard, and you could have punched holes right through them. There was no hole in heat at all in them.
When I went into it first, I had this huge big hole in the bathroom ceiling, and the sink was propped up with a stick. The walls were completely black. One wall in the kids' bedroom, the people previous had put up tin foil to try and keep the dampness out, but it didn't work, and gradually the wallpaper came peeling off again, and the lantern was just, the whole corners was complete black mould. It wasn't green or nothing, it was black all down the whole walls, the bathroom, the bedrooms. Got to the point where the kids had to sleep in one bedroom and I slept in the other one. And as I say, you put on your going to bed at night, you didn't take off you. The ice was on the inside of the windows. You had a 2-bar electric fire to keep you warm. That was for the whole masonette. And when the housing executive came out, you may as well have been talking to a brick wall. And I had a lot of complaints in about, I had the chute beside me, and there was 16 masonettes in the block, and the chute was emptied once a week. And the rats used to play tag out in the veranda with the dirt in and out. And I got to the point where I couldn't let the kids out at all. It was either over to my mummy's or stuck in the masonette. Plus the fact that they suffered a lot from diarrhoea, vomiting, sore ears, sore throats. The normal things that you suffer through dampness and cold, through no fault of your own. You just got to the point where you didn't go to the doctor anymore for a prescription. You just went to the receptionist and asked her to renew your last prescription. That's how it went with everybody in the estate, not just me. Everybody that lived in the masonette suffered, and that was it. That was our life in the masonette. It was like a prison more than anything, so it was.
Eventually, the women's campaign was successful and the masonettes demolished. Yet their struggle is not an exception. Many people in Belfast are fighting daily for essential repairs, or in the case of Divis Flats, for total demolition. 2 blocks have already been pulled down by the British government, but only a refurbishment programme is planned for those that remain. It is impossible to see how anyone could defend such a programme, or indeed, could make an improvement in what is a total disaster area.
I personally, living in Divis, wouldn't let them in to refurbish my flat, and a lot more people won't let them in to refurbish theirs, because we're not going to condemn ourselves to another 10 or 20 years in Divis to play as a housing executive. The conditions is really appalling. The kids have been in the parties born with dysentery and vomiting and diarrhoea.
Well, my wee boy just woke up one morning squealing with pains in the stomach, and I hadn't a clue, so I brought him to the doctor, and they had to rush and take his appendix out because he was that seriously ill. And then when he went back for a test after he was all right, he said that there was worms in his appendix. Or he says he's either picked it off somebody or he's got it in the street. So I explained where I lived, and I told him I lived in Divis Flats and about the chutes and dogs dirt on the back, and he says most likely that's where he's got it from.
A lot of people in Divis take nerve tablets, all kinds of sleeping tablets because you never get sleeping. The noise, if you walk along the balconies, the noise goes into the bedrooms. You're afraid to leave your door opened here. Because of the rats is on the balconies, on that top balcony over there. The rats was in the beds.
Divis and Moyard are parts of Belfast's 10 most socially and economically devastated areas, almost all of which are in the north and the west of the city. Of the 10, 7 are exclusively Catholic, 2 substantially so, and only 1, the Shankill, is Protestant. Northern Ireland has a much higher proportion of young people than Britain. A third of the population is under 25, and is generally concentrated in the areas of greatest need, where there is a history of long-term unemployment. Today, in many of these estates, there is over 80% unemployment. Youth unemployment is amongst the highest in Europe. In Catholic West Belfast, where only a quarter of the houses needed are being built, young people looking for homes have little hope of success. Any proposal for housing development outside traditional Catholic areas meets with intense opposition from the Protestant population. Overcrowding, always a problem, is today twice as serious here as anywhere in England. Since the Troubles, even more people have crowded into these areas as a result of fear, intimidation and sectarian attacks. These densely crowded living conditions are a major cause of stress, depression, infant mortality and infectious disease. Compared to other parts of Belfast, diseases like gastroenteritis in young children, dysentery and hepatitis are well above average. Many cases go unreported.
Well, we found a lot of people was afraid to go to their doctors or report the gastroenteritis or diarrhoea because the housing executive and a lot of other people accused us of being dirty and that it was our own uncleanliness, that we weren't cleaning our homes or looking after our children properly that was causing this gastroenteritis, and that it wasn't the sewage or the state or the bad housing or the dampness in the masonettes that was causing the sickness and the diarrhoea.
Infant mortality is the highest in the UK, with over a third of the deaths occurring in the post-neonatal period due to infections. The number of babies born in Northern Ireland with malformations of the brain and spinal cord is the highest recorded in the world. Incidences of spina bifida have been up to 10 times higher than in other parts of Europe.
Spina bifida is really quite a serious risk for women in Northern Ireland, especially women from working class areas. And within, for instance, the Belfast area, you can pinpoint it even more closely to specific regions of the city, and this was shown very clearly from statistical returns in the Baird report and the areas of housing need and so on. It all sort of matched up, and you could be fairly precise and say it was linked to the north and the west of the city predominantly, although obviously there were patches in other parts of the city as well.
One of the preventative measures possible is the screening of women for spina bifida by alpha-fetoprotein testing in the 16th week of pregnancy. It is a simple blood test that is routine practice in English hospitals. In Northern Ireland, such tests are at the doctor's discretion and have on occasion been refused. If the test is positive, the alternative, abortion, places doctors in a difficult and ambiguous legal position. The 1967 Abortion Act was never extended to Northern Ireland, and the current abortion law still carries the penalty of life imprisonment. The best solution is, of course, to prevent spina bifida happening in the first place. The evidence is increasingly indicating poor diet as a major cause, particularly a lack of fresh fruit and vegetables.
A woman's diet in the early stages of pregnancy is vital, but in fact the importance of diet is vital even before conception. It's been found that the malformations of brain and central nervous system, not to mention limbs, all takes place very, very early. The malformations of the brain and central nervous system all take place within the first 4 to 8 weeks of pregnancy, which is well before most women are ever aware that they are actually pregnant.
In large areas of Belfast, shopping facilities are ill-provided. Redevelopment of inner-city areas has meant that most small shops have disappeared, and they have not been replaced. Little thought was put into the planning of shops on the estates built in the 60s. In one area of West Belfast, there are barely more than a dozen small shops for over 20,000 people.
In the areas of special need, particularly within the city areas, obviously, the shops offer a much more limited selection than in the centre or in the more affluent areas. Generally, the food would maybe be less varied, and the fresh fruit and vegetables may not be of the quality or the variety that is necessary and usually is quite highly priced. And, you know, people living in these areas are on very restricted incomes and don't have the same element of choice. There is still generally a pretty poor level of housing and, of course, very poor social economic conditions, so that people's health is not really very good. And if a person, a woman for instance, is suffering from a low-level chest infection, which is quite likely if you're living in damp housing, then her absorption level of vitamins from her diet is going to be reduced. The other problem, of course, is that Northern Ireland is basically an agricultural country, and so everyone assumes that this must mean we get good fruit and vegetables at reasonable prices. But in fact, most of our fruit and vegetables are imported, and Ireland is now mainly a dairy producing country, and the small amount of arable farming that goes on tends to be either cereals or food which is some sort of fodder for the animals in the winter time. So it doesn't actually help, being an agricultural country, to provide the local inhabitants with a good, fresh fruit and vegetable diet at what you would think would be reasonable prices.
I don't buy any fruit, to be quite honest. All I have in my house is plastic fruit. Because we find at the end of the week, well, I find anyway, I just can't afford to buy fruit. You know, I couldn't 6 apples and 6 oranges. Fruit to us is a wee treat. You know, it'd be maybe making the kids, this might sound terrible, but like at lunchtime, maybe banana toasty. If I buy bananas, it's maybe to make banana toasties. As a meal, it's not for a snack, you know, for a thing. That is part of the meal.
If I bring apples or oranges in right away, you know, because I haven't seen them in so long, and they're just divine and it, you know. And just the same, like if I bring bananas in too, it'd be for banana toasties or something, like just, but fruit wouldn't sit in my house, and I can't afford to buy it anyway, yeah.
Maybe once or twice a week I would buy vegetables, because vegetables is very expensive. Maybe it's tins of peas or maybe beans or something to go along with the potatoes and sausages or whatever we're making. We would maybe make champ once a week, which is the traditional Irish dish, you know, it's scallions and potatoes and butter and that. And then maybe make stew once or twice a week with carrots and onions and that, and that would be another day with we have a class of vegetables. But say it'd be a Sunday, maybe you'd get pomfrey or cabbage or turnip or cauliflower, things like that.
Irish intake of fresh fruit and vegetables is one of the lowest in the developed world. We eat less fruit and vegetables than the English, whilst the French, Italian and Spanish eat up to 4 times as much as we do. Even the potato, for generations the staple diet of the poor, is increasingly being replaced by white bread. Our diet has close links with other diseases, such as certain cancers and heart disease, for which the risk factors are well known. They include both stressful living and our traditional diet, high in fatty foods, low in whole grain cereals, fresh fruit and vegetables. It has been shown that heart disease and many cancers are related to people's standard of living, and that the poor are at greatest risk. Many diseases evolve over a period of time. The seeds of heart disease may be sown very early in life.
My memories of food were that it was fairly plentiful, in the sense there was large quantities of it. But in hindsight, when I look at the sort of food that people ate, then you begin to notice today the sorts of things which were omitted. For example, you didn't eat an awful lot of fresh fruit. People didn't buy that, but they may have filled up on things like bread, on potatoes, on cheap foods, cheap ends of meat to make stews and soups. People had kind of filled themselves up so that they didn't feel hungry. But when we look at that type of diet now, we might say that it wasn't the most nutritious of diets. There was a lot of carbohydrate and a lot of fat in it.
In the 30s and that, you ate pig's cheek and pig's feet, and you would have made soup out of the boilings of your pig's cheek, and you got knees, and you would have got what they used to call hawks, although you never see the hawks now. And that was the big knee and part of the leg of a pig. And you would have got one of those and you would have roasted that for Sunday. It was good. And the pig's cheek was good. Because you got a pig's cheek, you would have boiled your pig's cheek, and the water it was boiled in, you done cabbage. And that was a really, what we would call would be roast meat and potatoes. Was a great dinner now on a Sunday. Through the week you would have maybe made champ, and that was, you boiled your potatoes and you mashed your potatoes, and you'd have bought scallions, what we know them by. You would have chopped those up and put them into a little milk and boiled them, and you emptied that into your potatoes. And you stirred all that up, and you got a plate of that with a big lump of butter in the middle of it, and a big cup of buttermilk, and that was your dinner.
A lot of soups and stews, things like that, and there seemed to be an awful lot of pig about, you know, pig's feet, pig's knees, whatever you call them. You know, that's the memories I have as a child. Just basic foods, just basics, you know, there was no fancy meats. It was always rough food, as my mummy called it.
As a result of the Troubles, the Royal Victoria Hospital in Belfast has become renowned for prestigious surgical techniques. The major emphasis is on highly sophisticated and expensive forms of treatment that bear little relationship to the root causes of bronchitis, pneumonia, and heart disease. Whilst huge resources are injected into the hospitals, in the surrounding areas, families are living in overcrowded, damp, and dilapidated housing, dependent on social security, suffering from conditions that could have been and can be prevented.
I think that the way a doctor is trained at the present time is not conducive to a doctor looking beyond a patient. In other words, a doctor is not taught to look beyond the symptoms which a person has. So if I come with symptoms of bronchitis, or I have a heart complaint, or I have an infection of some description, then the doctor will treat those. He'll give me, or she will give me, drugs to treat the symptoms. But doctors aren't taught to look at the whole context of someone's illness. So they don't look at the fact that because someone's living in a damp and drafty house may well be the reason they're having bronchitis. Doctors are taught, in a sense, to look in very narrow vision. If we look at a typical training, say in Queen's University for a doctor, of the time spent in training, only 10% will be devoted to looking at what's called social medicine. In other words, looking at issues beyond the simple pathology of one disease, looking at a person's whole environment and judging their health. If we look at Belfast, for example, I mean, most of the health surveys, as such surveys which looked at people's diseases or whatever rates of disease, have actually been carried out initially years ago by geographers, but more latterly in the last few years actually by women and by people in their own communities. We've examples like Divis, Moyard. We've had examples of oral history projects which women have carried out looking at their health. So in fact most of the more recent surveys have come as a response to local people making demands.
We've brought out a survey on environmental health, which we do round the doors. We ask questions on children's health, people's health, many tablets are on, what their flats like, many bedrooms. The whole issue on Divis is in that environmental health study. But now we're hoping that with this environmental health study, we might be able to get Divis knocked down. It might be a memory to look back on that we lived in Divis, that we had the courage to live in Divis as women, to get women that have families, so big a family stuck in Divis, and nobody cared about us.
The general practitioner is seen by the medical establishment as having a key role as the family doctor within the community. The Moyard Health Survey discovered that this was a myth, as most doctors' surgeries were often miles away from where their patients actually lived. As a result, many families did not make the journey to see their doctor, but went straight to the hospital's outpatients department for everyday health care.
The reason I done the health survey was that I thought it was a worthwhile thing to do if it was going to make any improvement in Moyard whatsoever, that it needed local involvement. Well, I was quite shocked at one of the finds about there was a lot of speech defects, and it came from dampness, that the children's hearing were being affected, so therefore then their speech was being affected as well. And I didn't realise this. I don't think anybody realised it at the time, you know, until the survey was done. We found out that an awful lot of people take for granted that we have no shopping facilities, we have no post office, we have only one doctor, and he has got a hell of a lot of people for to cope with in this area. But I think it was just really to confirm, there's been so many other surveys done before, and it was just to confirm what we knew already, that it was bad housing, bad conditions, bad health, inadequate shopping facilities.
Despite a new health centre having been built to serve Moyard and its surrounding area, there is still only one part-time doctor practising from this surgery for an estimated 20,000 people.
Well, there's a health centre that has just been built a few yards up the road there. I think it cost £1 million or something to build, and £78,000 furnish it and that. And the only thing that's in it is there's health visitors are in it, and there's a chiropodist in it, and there's social workers in it. But there's no GPs in it. The GPs refuse to go into it because apparently for some reason it's going to cost them an awful lot of money to rent. So they find that why go into a health centre and pay an enormous amount to rent when they can have a sort of wee pokey place and pay sort of £1.50 or something a week. Talking to the women in the area and the women in our group, we would like to see a well women's centre. It's a place where women can go, talk out their problems to a woman doctor. All those things that affect women, who they wouldn't talk to their doctor. And if they find sort of there's women in a well women's centre, they could go along quite easy and be confident enough to speak to them.
There's a terrible lot of women under stress here. It's troubles, the housing, not enough money, and they just end up on tablets, most of them. Most of the time you hear they're talking, they're going to the doctor, they end up on nerve tablets. There's a terrible lot of people on nerve tablets in this whole area, and the whole area is surrounding too. I think they'll just walk in and get it off the receptionist, and most of them it just goes in with the same problem. The doctor doesn't even look at them, just hand them a prescription and it's tablets.
Doctor, give me pills to block my ills. My mental stress, you see, not society. Consumption is my disease, is my disease, is my disease, is my disease, is my disease.
In the last, say, 3 or 4 years in particular in Belfast, we've seen a lot of women in different areas right across the city looking for the first time at the issue of their health and their community's health. And that has resulted in really an explosion of interest in the issue of health. And it's ranged from women, as we've said before, doing surveys about the health needs, women protesting about the inadequacies of their estates, no doctors, no dentists, no chemists or whatever. It's been through educational classes where women have come to learn about their health and how they can improve it, through classes about diet and nutrition. We've seen also a whole explosion of self-help groups. One area in particular where we've seen that has been in women who've suffered from depression. We've had a number of self-help groups there, women who've been on drug therapy for a long time and have discovered that there are other ways to deal with depression.
We got together because we were all having the same problems. We didn't realise it at the time because you tend to think somebody else is better off than you know, but when I got to know Aileen and we sat and we talked about things, you know, it came out like we were both having the same problems, money problems, children, food problems, and how to get this and that and the other, you know, just for the children. And we formed a group, which I thought was very good, for it helping me personally. I know it helped me a lot, because I was just sitting in the house all the time on my own.
You need your own people. You need somebody who has the same problem as yourself to support you the same way as you can support them, because nobody understands until they're in that situation just what it's like. I'm not saying it helps your money, your food or anything, but you don't feel inadequate then. You don't feel helpless or that you're not able to cope anymore, because everybody's in the same position.
Things have got that bad, situations in the areas have got that bad too, and the men just seem to be ignoring it at certain parts, like, you know, and the women have just started to get up and said, well, right, if I want something for my children, I'll have to go out and do it, you know, and they started to fight back.
I think the long-term solution must be where people in general are aware of where their good health or their bad health comes from, and that people make demands, and women in particular make demands on the medical establishment for the type of medical service that they need. Not one that the medical establishment has regarded as the model, but one which meets people's needs, one which looks at their health in the whole kind of complexity of their lives. I think the first step is women generally taking a positive kind of hold of their lives and saying, I have a right to good health, and here are the ways in which I'm going to achieve it.
The stark realities of war in Northern Ireland, of long-term neglect of housing and the environment, of the high cost of living compared with Britain, and the far greater number of people existing in social security, has created a critical situation. Given these realities, the increasing emphasis on the individual to improve their own health through lifestyle changes such as diet and exercise deals only with the tip of the iceberg. Yes, we do need lifestyle changes, but ones that are further reaching than jogging or aerobics. Many of our doctors are happier to walk the hospital corridors treating patients after the event for numerous diseases that are mostly environmental in origin. How many doctors have actively campaigned to get flats like Divis demolished? Our GPs prescribe more and more tranquilizers for all the social ills. Is this the best solution on offer? Many women are organising, increasing the demand for more attention to be paid to their own and their community's health. Self-help groups, community action, protest, and campaigns to end repressive laws are all part of the struggle to gain control over our lives. Control over our lives as women in the struggle for the far-reaching changes that are needed to break the cycle of ill health and to ensure that the legacy is not passed on to future generations.
What sickness, what brazen dissatisfaction.